Welcome to the fifth in the Thames Luminaries lecture series, a truly collaborative effort to celebrate our local history and our local luminaries drawn together by the River Thames. My name is Rachel Morrison and I'm from Marble Hill, and I'll be the host for these lectures. So without further ado, may I hand you over to the wonderful chair of the Thames Luminaries lecture series. She's a lecturer herself, she's a literary historian, and she's pretty darn fantastic. It's Professor Judith Hawley.
Thank you, Rachel, for that generous introduction, and also for all the work you've done to run this series. It's been a treat to work with Rachel, with Robert, who does the ticketing for us, and all the many people working behind the scenes, and also with our historic organisations. It has been extraordinary to bring together so many experts, and also to bring in such a large audience. It's a pleasure to know that there are so many of you who want to connect with our historic properties and explore our gardens, which we will one day will be out there together exploring these wonderful places. And so let me introduce our speaker for tonight. Emily Parker is a landscape advisor at English Heritage. She actually began as an intern at English Heritage and worked her way up. And she is now the main researcher for the 20 or so historic gardens in their care. She also writes conservation management plans and interpretive texts for online and on-site interpretation of spaces, and advises on the restoration and conservation of projects such as at Marble Hill. In 2018, her article on the design of the garden at Marble Hill was published in the Garden History Journal. So I'm happy to hand over now to Emily Parker. Thank you.
Thank you, Judith. It's lovely you've joined me. I'm not sure I've ever spoken to such a large audience, so it's nice to be able to do that from the comfort of my own spare bedroom. I'm really looking forward to talking to you all today about Marble Hill. As Judith said, I've been working on Marble Hill for quite a long time now. I've been researching the garden for about 6 or 7 years now. And in today's presentation, I'm going to share some of that research with you. There is so much to cover, so I'm going to stick strictly to a discussion about the design of the garden, and I couldn't even possibly fit all of that into a 20-minute presentation. So I look forward to delving deeper into some other topics during the questions at the end. So here we go, there's Marble Hill. Let's get started. So today, the park at Marble Hill is a popular local amenity, managed and cared for by English Heritage. Its very survival as a green space is extraordinary in this busy, popular corner of London, and it was in fact saved from becoming a housing estate following a public campaign in the early 1900s. The pure white Palladian house overlooks playing fields and lawn, sitting with a landscape with almost exactly the same boundaries as it had at the end of the lifetime of its most famous owner. So here she is on the screen now. We can see Henrietta Howard, later the Countess of Suffolk. She was part of Georgian Court Society, mistress of the Prince of Wales, who was later George II, and a member of an elite circle of influential cultural, intellectual, and political friends. She created Marble Hill House in the 1720s as a retreat from court life and a place to entertain this circle of friends. The location of Marble Hill, right in the centre of Twickenham, with its large frontage on the river, cemented Howard's position in the heart of this very fashionable neighbourhood. So, in this presentation, I'm going to talk about 4 main topics. I will start by talking about Marble Hill's location on the Thames, which makes sense with this sort of Thames Luminaries theme. And then I'm going to talk about Howard's social circle and how this impacted on the design of the garden. We will then look at the design in detail, what it included, and how it was laid out. Finally, I will talk about the grottos at Marble Hill and new research which is shedding light on Howard's involvement in their design. So, why is Marble Hill located where it is? Howard's position as woman of the bedchamber to Caroline, Princess of Wales, as well as her role as mistress to the Prince of Wales, meant that location on the Thames would be important. However, she only actually moved into Marble Hill permanently in 1734, when she retired from court. In 1735, after Howard left court, Pope wrote, and we'll hear a lot more about Alexander Pope in this talk, "There is a greater court now at Marble Hill than at Kensington, and God knows when it will end." Howard had certainly forged her new role among the intellectual, cultural and political elite, which centred on her home on the bank of the Thames at Marble Hill, in the heart of fashionable Twickenham. So in 1726, while Henrietta was still at court, Princess Caroline, Prince visited Marble Hill, and Lady Bristol describes how the princess with all her children went by water last Thursday and landed to go and see Mrs. Howard's house at Marble Hill. And just at landing there is some very coarse new gravel laid, where my Lord Selkirk was awkward enough to throw me down in helping me out of the boat. Well, poor Lady Bristol. But this is interesting because it's the only known reference for visitors arriving at Marble Hill by river in Howard's lifetime. There's a popular and fashionable way to travel in Twickenham. This is likely that it's happened frequently, we just don't have the records to show that it did. The mention of the new gravel probably refers to the newly built terrace that was created along the Thames for Howard when she needed to provide a new right-of-way to replace one that ran through the area that she turned into her new garden. It also shows that visitors were able to access and visit Marble Hill in 1726, even before the works to the house were finally finished in 1729. So Howard was surrounded by friends who were knowledgeable about garden design, including Alexander Pope, who we can see on the screen now, and Lord Ilay, as well as many others. She also enlisted the help of a professional, Charles Bridgman, and it seems likely that the garden was created at Marble Hill was an amalgamation of ideas, as often was the case in early 18th century architecture and garden design, especially when the owner was fashionable, well-connected, and at the forefront of taste, like Henrietta was. From the letters between Pope and Bridgman, Howard's involvement can be glimpsed as she participated in the initial discussions, meeting with them both at Marble Hill in 1724. Without more evidence, we can only ever hypothesize about how the extent of her involvement in the design. As a fashionable and well-connected client, it is hard to imagine she did not have her own ideas to bring to the discussion. So, the building of Marble Hill and the layout of the garden was made possible after a large gift of stock, jewels, plate and mahogany and furniture to Henrietta from the Prince of Wales in 1723. This settlement was held in trust, managed by a group of trustees, which included Lord Ilay, which we can see on the right here, who later became the third Duke of Argyll. And it was directly stipulated in that gift that it was to be free from any interference from Howard's estranged husband, who he had a very turbulent relationship with. Lord Ilay was a close friend of Howard and lived nearby at his estate at Whitton, which sadly no longer exists. He was an enthusiastic collector of exotic plants and created a garden to showcase these. Although Lord Ilay's involvement in Howard's financial affairs is clearly documented, it is harder to establish if he had a role in design ideas for the garden at Marble Hill. A clue might come from the Earl of Peterborough, who was another person who really wanted to be involved in the gardens at Marble, in which he writes to Howard about no longer being involved with the development of the house and garden. I dislike my rivals among the living. Must I yield to Lord Herbert and Lord Ilay? This implies that Lord Ilay may have offered architectural or horticultural advice to Howard, or perhaps both. So, when it came to the layout of the garden, the first known correspondence about the design is between Lord Peterborough and Alexander Pope. In the summer and autumn of 1723, Lord Peterborough was asking for measurements of the land at Marble Hill, as well as trying to organise a visit with Pope to discuss planting. Pope's involvement is clear even from this very early correspondence. In autumn 1724, conversations seem to have been progressing. Pope writes to his friend saying that his mind is more focused on the works in Howard's garden than in his own garden, or even his writing. In September 1724, Pope met with Charles Bridgman and Howard at Marble Hill to discuss the garden, and Bridgman writes that he is working on a plan. That's a really interesting point for us, because that plan is not thought to have survived. There's not any sort of Bridgman plan known about for Marble Hill. A year later, Howard and Pope's mutual friend Martha Blount describes how Pope is very full of plans for buildings and gardens, which I find not owning so much the beauty of Lord Cobham's as the desire he has of being serviceable to you at Marble Hill. His involvement, therefore, obviously continued as work progressed. He even visited Marble Hill in Howard's absence, writing to her in 1726 to congratulate her on the birth of her new calf and describing her as a pastoral lady. So, an early garden plan for Marble Hill does survive. In 1724, Pope wrote about Howard's garden design, saying that he had spent many hours in studying for hers and in drawing new plans for her. So this plan, which we can see on the screen now, let me just move myself out of the way so I can see it properly. So a plan, this is attributed to Pope, so it's not signed by him, but we're pretty confident that it is by him for numerous reasons, which we can go on about in the chat if we want to a bit later. So it includes a wilderness of fruit trees, which you can see here, flowering shrubs, which it mentions is labelled down here, tightly winding walks, so you can see these very closely winding walks through here, and then there's some beautiful little bits on here which just says sort of things like different types of hedges. So we've got a yew hedge, and it says low hedge somewhere, low hedge there, I think. And something I really want to hone in on is that it has these two semicircular areas through here, which are labelled as a parterre of parterres of flowers, which you can see just about here. So there's this semicircular arbour here, which you just see around there, and this is labelled parterre of flowers. And then we can also see in the bottom corner here this square-shaped mount, which is described down here. The existence of this plan by Pope is highly significant, as although sketches for garden features are found amongst his writings, this would be his only known surviving plan for a whole garden design. Pope assisted in only a handful of gardens, although his role in advocating design inspired by classical and ancient influences had a much wider impact. Pope's inspiration came from the classical texts he was translating, such as the Odyssey, alongside principles taken from painting. He was probably also familiar with the letters of Pliny the Younger about his villas at Laurentum and Tusculum. Therefore, the involvement of Pope and his innovative approach to landscape design and theory in this period are particularly relevant for understanding the approach to the garden layout at Marble Hill. And so those of you who went to Marin's talk on Friday will have heard a lot more about Alexander Pope. So hopefully that's helping to put some of that stuff into context. So the design drawn by Pope, which we see here, only included a very small parcel of land, which was part of the initial negotiations in 1724. Throughout her lifetime, Howard would continue to acquire more land, resulting in the extent of the park that we see today. But so, as you see here, so this is Marble Hill in the middle. This only goes in a very small section, and the land continues down here, and the river's off the page somewhere at the bottom. So this is a very, very small section which she owned in 1724. So access to the land down to the river probably acquired in sort of later in 1724 after Alexander Pope had drawn this plan. So, and then the acquisition of that land is thought to have made a variation to the scheme. So they changed it after they acquired that land, so it was edited from Pope's initial design. So a series of plans in the late 1740s, probably from 1748 to 1749, showing the house, gardens and enclosures of Marble Hill belonging to the Right Honourable Countess of Suffolk, records the layout of the gardens 25 years after these initial discussions. And you can see one of these here. So this is the sort of final version. There's also a sort of draft version as well, which has a slightly different feel to it. It's also good for seeing different details. And this is a kind of close-up on that middle bit as well. So this is the garden area, and this is the house, and this is the Thames down here. And this next one is a close-up of that garden area. At this time, the garden included several garden buildings, such as a greenhouse, which you can see in this top corner here, grotto, which you can see down here, some serpentine paths, which you can see along here, a flower garden, which is this thing labelled here at D, groves of trees, there's lots of groves of trees, can't miss them, but these key ones down to the river, and a 9-pin bowling alley, which is just here. It also had things like an ice house, which still exists today, which is up here, and a seat in front of it. Known additions to the estate after this 1749 plan, but during Howard's lifetime, included a Chinese fence and a sweetwort nursery in the north of the estate, and a Gothic farm or folly was also added, probably the result of encouragement from Horace Walpole, called the Priory of St Hubert. In 1758, he described how Howard had at last entirely submitted her barn to our ordination. Although Howard made changes to both the house and garden during her lifetime, most of the substantial work appears to have taken place in the 1720s. Bills in 1724 and 1725 refer to a mount and bowling green, as well as a yew hedge. So equipment for the gardeners is also being purchased, including a garden roll by the order of Mr. Pope, which you can see there in 1725. And in 1727, Jonathan Swift, who was a friend of Henrietta's, published his poem, Pastoral Dialogue between Richmond Lodge and Marble Hill. And I've got a scrawl extract of that here. And in that, he describes the garden's ice house, the walks, the plantations, groves, and wilderness. Even allowing for some poetic exaggeration, Swift's description mirrors the type of garden shown on the 1749 plan over 20 years later. In 1728, Roger Morris, who was the architect of the house, is paid for four buildings in the garden at Marble Hill. They are likely to have been the ice house seat, which you can see here as a kind of extract from that plan, the greenhouse, which you can see from a kind of very long shot from 1755 on the right, a china room, which I couldn't get a picture of because we couldn't get copyright clearance, but we can all imagine it was a beautiful classical design as well. And the fourth one is kind of harder to determine. It could have been the ice house seat itself, or possibly the coach house, although its location in a separate corner of the garden estate begs the question of whether this could be described as in the garden. Photos of the greenhouse and china room before they were demolished in the early 20th century show they were built in a classical style to match the house. The probable use of the same architect and builder, Roger Morris, at the same time the house was being built indicates that the garden and the house were considered as a unified design concept. So I just want to go back a second and have a look at the two plans side by side. So this is the sort of Alexander Pope attributed plan on the right, and this is the 1749 plan, which shows the garden as built in 1749. So there's quite a lot of similarities between the two designs, which I think it's worth kind of pointing out in detail. There's this straight terrace on this side, and the other terrace going down on the right here to the west. And then we've got this kind of very clear axial arrangement down the middle of the site with this kind of semicircular arbor. We call this the sort of oval lawn these days, but that's not a historic term. And it's got these sort of arbors around it, which you can just about make out on these Pope plan. There's also these sinuous serpentine paths, both here and below in this sort of little quarter here, which is very similar in design. And obviously there's the general point about it being these two sides of the house having these two separate areas of it, very different use later. So it's quite nice to be able to see these two plans side by side and look at their similarities if we're talking about Pope's influence on the final design of the garden. Marble Hill also drew the attention of another landscape designer who was born in Twickenham, Batty Langley. He was involved in the design of Thomas Vernon's garden at Twickenham Park in the early 1720s, as well as producing a perhaps unsolicited design for Orleans House next door to Marble Hill. Langley's comments about the garden at Marble Hill, which he published in his book New Principles of Gardening in 1728, were not complimentary. He wrote, "Observe the error in the slopes of the garden of the Honourable Mrs. Howard at Twickenham being viewed at the river at Thames at Richmond." He attributed this error to Howard's desire to imitate ancient architecture in her terraces. And we can see those terraces very clearly on this Heckel engraving from 1749. And they're not quite as obvious today, but you can still see them, and you can definitely feel them if you walk up and down them. They're a favourite spot for people to do running exercises up and down the slopes. So it's a nice little spot. There's been some kind of speculation that Langley's criticism of design was possibly motivated by professional jealousy on not being consulted as the garden designer. So The grotto is one of the most sort of famous parts of the landscape at Marble Hill today. So I thought I'd spend this kind of last bit of the talk talking about that grotto in a little bit more detail. The grotto at Marble Hill was decorated by Howard and her niece, probably with advice from many of her knowledgeable friends. Exactly when the grotto, labelled on the 1749 plan, was constructed is not known. There is no documentary evidence for the grotto until 1739, when Howard writes that she is head and ears in shells. Progress on the grotto was ongoing in 1742, when a friend hoped it continued prosperously, and it was still being altered in the 1760s when Howard's great niece, who also lived at Marble Hill, wrote to her parents saying that she was working hard in the grotto. It is probable that the creation of the grotto was taking place over a period of 30, perhaps even 40 years. This time frame, however, is further confused by contemporary references to two grottos at Marble Hill. A poem by Marble Hill by Anne Chambers, which is a new discovery as part of this new research we were doing, is published in 1764, and it describes a grotto as well as a rustic grot. So this first half of the poem talks about the grotto, and then by the time it describes it, beautiful jasmine and lilac too, and all the lovely description of the planting. At the bottom it talks about the rustic grot. The poem describes the difference between them. One is the kind of shell grotto, the remains of which are visible in the park today, and the other is more hidden with large rocks. Large rocks, huge trees and rocks conjunctivize, as it puts it in the poem. The location of this second grotto has caused much debate, and whenever I go on site and do tours, it's one of the things people are most keen to talk about. And this poem and other contemporary accounts, such as Henrietta Howard in 1760, locate it very close to the other grotto. So if you consult our trusty plan, so this is a very close-up view of that 1749 plan that I showed you earlier. You can see E, which is labelled as the grotto, and you can see the kind of the grotto entrance and the walls of the grotto, which is the grotto that survives at Marble Hill today. Then you also can see below it this rocky archway and this kind of rock, I think it's kind of a rock wall or rocky, there's definitely some rocky outcrops here, and this kind of rock arch, which is quite popular. You see in sort of places like Stourhead and Stowe, these kind of rock arches that are very popular in this period. So I'm happy to debate it later, but I think that these are the two grottos that are being described at Marble Hill. I mean, this one's particularly interesting because it, in the Henrietta Howard account, it talks about being having a view of Richmond Hill, which is possibly just about possible from there. Yeah, I think that's possibly the most likely. An idea of the kind of decoration that probably would have been found in the grotto is explained in an intriguing letter from Mary Lyles. In the undated letter, she writes to an unknown woman, providing a practical description of how grotto elements can be created, and it includes recipes for cement and artificial coral, and the whole letter appears to be written as guidance for Henrietta Howard on grotto decoration, and it reads as though Howard is at the very beginning of her project, as it starts with very basic concepts, which may allow a provisional date of the 1730s. In particular, two parts of the letters reflect this, and I've put these on your screen. So, if Lady Suffolk has a design to put any icicles in her grotto, and I think, Madame, I have answered all the queries you gave me, and if I can be of any service to Lady Suffolk next spring when I shall be in town, I shall with pleasure obey her commands. The letter provides a fascinating glimpse into grotto building in the 18th century, as it also describes how to wash shells and how to stick shells and cinders to brick or board walls. Mary Lyles was born in 1699, and, along with her eight of her sisters, decorated a grotto at Crux Easton in Hampshire. It is thought that Pope stayed with the Lyell family in 1733 and wrote the lines described as an inscription on a grotto of shells at Crux Easton, the work of 9 young ladies, the same year, although the first known record of the poem is not till 1748. As Pope is known to have contributed to the design of the Marble Hill Gardens in the 1720s, and he was passionate about grottos, it would not be unrealistic to assume his involvement. The link between Pope and Mary Lyles and her letter to Howard raises even more questions about how the grotto was designed and decorated, and the advice that Howard was receiving. It is widely known that grotto decorating was a fashionable pastime for women in the 18th century, but this letter provides a clear evidence that the skills required to do so were also being discussed and shared amongst a network of female grotto decorators. So, as a significant historic landscape, as well as a much-loved local amenity and green space, the management of Marble Hill today requires careful balance and consideration. In the 20th century, the survival of the historic structure of the garden was threatened by the removal of historic buildings such as the greenhouse. This, combined with a lack of resources, meant that the significance of the garden was little recognised. This is currently being rebalanced following funding from the National Lottery Heritage Fund, which aims to improve park facilities, the ecological potential of the park, and restore the historic design. One of the primary aims of restoring the garden is to unify the house and garden, which, although designed as a coherent scheme, have become separated by different management regimes. The revival of the landscape at Marble Hill will ensure it survives as a recognisable and important historic landscape for future generations to enjoy, and that it continues to warrant its prominent position along the historic houses along the Thames. Thank you very much.